Hello. So this is something new that we're doing. We're going to be having a relatively informal discussion about some actual client data that Pat has supplied, and just talking about the data and the interpretation, because I feel like a lot of these various data tests and like isokinetic tests, especially, people don't really learn a lot about in school. So we're teaching you here
What better
from what we
way
know.
than real patient examples, you know? So I'll just go ahead and get into it. So what we are going to look at here is going to be a isometric test that was done at 60 degrees of knee flexion for knee extension and knee flexion. For each of these, the person gets 5 warm-ups with 15 seconds rest in between each warm-up, and then they get 3 actual trials, 100%, and I give them around 30 seconds in between each actual trial. And we do this right and left, and they do knee extension straight into knee flexion once they're done with those, and then flip sides. And so what we're looking at here is the isometric knee extension test. And just a little background on this individual. They are a mid to late 30-year-old gentleman who works for the fire department and actually had ACL reconstruction back in 2010 on the right side, and then had a meniscus injury on the left side, then a meniscus injury on the right side, and those were both surgically done again. And then he had another revision on the right. So this was all between 2010 to 2012, a lot of knee operations going on. And he comes to me because he is stating that he cannot partake in activities that he likes to do, such as like mountain biking, trail running, or other recreational sports, with his major concern being he cannot deaccelerate. He states that he cannot, take a very hard penultimate step or, plant step. And if he has to do a turn, he has to take many little steps. And if he goes running, it's very variable on each day if he will be able to or not. And his most is only 6 miles. And then the next day he might be able to do anything. So because nothing else was really present on exam, we got him down on our HUMAC norm isokinetic device, and we ran through this test. And our standard at our clinic for what we look for people who want to get back to higher level physical activity is 100% body weight for peak torque for knee extension. And as we look here, the blue is his right side and the red is the left side. And we can see there's that deficit. So we're going to be primarily focusing on just that top peak torque foot pounds. And the red usually signifies something is like glaring, and you should definitely look at it. So as we see, there's a major deficit, but then also just relative peak torque for both are not great for level of activity that this gentleman is doing. And although the coefficient of variance is pretty high in terms of arbitrary, just 10%, he had an 11%, but as stated, this could either be due to not being used to the test, but that would be more so for isokinetic. Isometric is pretty easy because they're not moving. They're just kicking into something immovable. Or it could be that neuromuscular adaptations are not there, and that force output is just so variable because it is so either inhibited or it's just not wanting to do its job. And so we see this for knee extension, and essentially his torque on that right side is very low. And so I've seen this gentleman 2 times now. I then did a isokinetic test, not test, but testing more so as a training stimulus, where we were doing eccentric knee extension, and we would see that force curve. And we'll probably look at this at a future time, but right around that 60-degree mark, so 50 to 70 degrees of knee flexion, you would see a reversal of the curve. So what that means is that he does not want to be producing force at that range. And so what does that mean for his presentation? He cannot do that deacceleration because he cannot take and produce that force when going into those deeper knee flexion angles like that 60 degrees. So what do we do about this? Currently, I am programming just some yielding isometrics or holding isometrics. It depends on whatever definition you want to use, specifically targeted at that range of motion at a lighter load, just so we can start to get that stimulus and not so much just do like pure knee extensions, because I really want to hone in on that one specific range of motion that he's having his deficit in. And then we're just going to retest this, every 4 weeks. And I'm sure, so probably 4 to 6 weeks from now, we'll probably get an update on this gentleman and see how he's doing. But to flip to the next one here, we look at knee flexion or those hamstrings, and boy, are they hamstrings. They surely are not the ham chains we look for. Usually, usually we look for 60% body weight when it comes to this. Now, this is pretty symmetrical on both sides, and that coefficient of variance is pretty low. So it's just, again, hamstrings are not really doing what we'd want them to do. And after further discussion with this gentleman, we talked about doing some very constrained knee extension work and knee flexion work through using machine-based exercises. Well, this guy also worked as a PT tech, and he asked me, well, isn't that bad for me? So seemingly this gentleman has never done constrained knee extension or knee flexion work. And it's pretty evident that he's not wanting to get into those positions. So when his first treatment session came, we were doing sled push and sled pull just to warm up, see how it looked. Sled push, his heel on that right side did not want to stay high. He was just dropping straight into terminal knee extension. Like, he could not hold that bent knee position. That's why his heel would drop. So he couldn't produce that force at that bent knee position when pushing. And then when he was pulling, you would see a little hike up when he was on that right leg. So instead of staying seated and pulling, kind of like how we would generally say, oh, I want you to pretend like you're sitting in a chair and not coming out of that, so you're targeting that deeper knee flexion, he would stand on up out of it relatively to the left side and almost just shoot the knee back instead of staying in that deeper knee flexion angle. So I kind of discussed already how we're implementing this, and we'll see how he does going forward here. But I think he has a pretty high ceiling and a pretty low floor right now. So I have some pretty good feelings about how this rehab potential is.
Sweet. As you were talking too, I wanted to clarify something with you and for myself, that like there's a lot of information on this, and I feel like you can definitely you can use all of that information, but it seems like you're really only concerned about that first, like the peak torque, essentially.
Yeah. So that comes down to, what is your goal as the sports scientist, the therapist? What are you looking to get out of it? When I do this test for the first time, I'm just looking for that peak. I'm not too worried about that. So the torque at 200 and 400 milliseconds, that'd be, you're trying to see what's that rate of development, what's that rate of force development, and kind of that torque to 20 to 80% slope. How are they developing that force? If I was cueing him differently, and if that was my goal, I would put more weight into that. But right now, I'm just primarily looking for what's your maximal output. So that's why I just focus on the peak torque right now. As we get through the rehab process, that might change, but I hope that clarifies that.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And it's just interesting, like where my brain goes as well with like, especially looking at the graphs, and then actually the graphs then help inform, like they help make sense of these numbers for me too. But like a reason that he's having a lot of difficulty running downhill is he has such poor rate of torque development on that right side. Like you can see in the graph that like it really doesn't shoot up very high at all, and that the torque at 200 milliseconds, torque at 400 milliseconds, and that torque 20 to 80%, like all really reflect that. And you need to develop torque really quickly when you're running downhill, because
Yeah, and
that's a very strong eccentric contraction.
well, and also to like go along with that, when he came back for his first treatment session, we did as his training modality eccentric knee extension, and we were doing it at we were initially doing it 40 degrees per second, and I had him going through 80 degrees of range, so going from 10 degrees of flexion to 90 degrees. And he said that was way too fast. He said he couldn't even do that, and like he didn't feel like he had a fighting chance. So we took it down to 10 degrees per second. So, 8 seconds of just eccentric contraction all the way down. But he said that was the only way he felt like he could generate force. And even then, you would see going from terminal, well, not terminal, 10 degrees of knee flexion. Okay, he's producing torque. And then he got to the 55 degrees, and then it would just inverse. And it was like, it just shut off. And it's not like he just gave up. Like, same thing with this test. This guy was gritting teeth. He was sweating. He was red. Because that's another thing when you do any of these tests, you have to make sure the person's actually putting the effort in, or the values just don't mean anything. And when he was doing this, I was watching him and he was gritting. So, yeah. So, to your point, though, Mike, like that eccentric control, that eccentric output is not there, which makes everything such as descending, makes everything such as cutting or turning, planting, like all those things are going to be that much more challenging.
Yeah. Brian, did you have anything?
No, I would be interested in seeing that training stimulus that you were talking about. Maybe that will be our next kind of dive in. I think that would be interesting to say, okay, what does that inverse relationship look like, or curve look like?
Yeah.
For those that are listening, obviously, there's this big printout that we're looking at. So I think it is interesting. Like, yeah, I think setting a good foundation of strength is like your biggest sort of lowest hanging fruit for this individual, and then working on rate of force development would be your secondary sort of focus. You could potentially get away with like a vertical integration type of training where you're doing a little bit of rate of force development and heavier on the strength, so you're not just completely taking it out of your position or out of your programming, but this guy can obviously like afford to be a little bit strength bias when it comes to this. And then going to like the programming side of it, it's like, yeah, this is taking an open kinetic chain. And I'm sure he was very like, oh, well, why don't you do closed chain stuff? And I think the pendulum has swung a little bit. We just have to keep in mind that we can't let it swing all the way to open kinetic chain and isolated movements.
Totally.
But I think that's, again, comes down to the clinician and understanding what this person has to do. And it sounds like he's very active between being a firefighter, all the recreational activities that he participates in. It is a very physically demanding individual that is present for Pat. So I think it's understanding and meeting that person where he is at in his sort of journey back to getting back to life.
Yeah. And I think kind of now we're getting outside of this, but when you talk about the training and not having pendulum swing too far, I think that's a great point to bring up, because I feel like we always talk about doing open connect chain stuff, whether it be your isometrics or just doing reps on the knee extension. But I also have this gentleman doing some split squats, but with his back supported on the squat rack. And we're going down and, doing like a quasi ISO where we're eccentrically lowering, getting to that point, making sure, he's feeling like he has a lot of weight on that front leg, and then just attacking that position and really feeling like we're getting at that certain angle with the foot actually on the ground. So I think it's much like a lot of things when it comes to rehab. You know, you have to find the good balance of both worlds, you know, and use your clinical judgment accordingly.
And Pat, could I have a follow-up question? How often are you training this individual on the actual HUMAC?
I am hoping to do it every time he comes in, at least to monitor the eccentric training to see, because we're doing it almost as, yes, it's training, but it's also serial testing. You know,
Right.
I'm training him because we're doing 4 sets of 6 repetitions of 100% eccentric control for knee extension. But each time we do it, I'm going to be watching for, all right, how's that curve looking today? Are we getting a nice smooth curve today? Are we actually producing more torque at that knee flexion angle? So yeah, I'm trying to get him on. I'm seeing him twice a week, and I'm trying to get him on every time he comes in, at least for one stimulus, which will be that eccentric knee extension right now at the 10 degrees per second until he can bump up to higher velocities.
Now, do you think he'll eventually see, just from like, I guess, exposure to the test, will you get some, like, I guess maybe not so cleared numbers because he's just getting better at the test?
Yeah, I think that comes into I want to say the problem when it comes to this kind of testing, but it definitely raises questions about it to where, okay, someone does a bad isometric test, quote unquote bad, you know, and then you have them just do a bunch of knee extensions at a rep range, rep and sets that you believe is good for strengthening, and then they come back and they did better. It is, to your point, Brian, where are they just getting better at the test, or are they actually improving? I would say I would just have to align that with, is he getting better with these activities that he was having challenges with? And if that question is, I mean, if that answer is no, then okay, yeah, he's probably just getting better at the test. But I'd be damned if this guy doesn't get better with these day-to-day things with how low we're at right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, I have a patient that I had sent for isokinetic testing and she had never done it. And obviously her scores were not as good as we were hoping for. But I also think that if she were to go back the following day or even the day after, I think she would automatically do better because she now knows and is exposed to it. So
Totally.
I think
Yeah.
that's just, again, one piece of the puzzle that we all have to take in. It's not just the end all be all. I think we have to just understand that.
Yeah, especially when it comes to isokinetic, because most people work out isotonically and have never tried pushing against something that does not move faster if they push harder against it. So
Right.
cool. All right.
Yeah,
Any
well,
other
yeah.
questions?
No, I think
Comments?
this is a great first episode in this series. So we'll see where this takes us.
Sick.